A 40-year-old policy that critics say has destroyed entire communities and put a disproportionate number of African Americans behind bars. So why is the US war on drugs missing from this year's political debate? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. President Barack Obama's drug czar has said that the US war on drugs has not been successful and that, quote, it's very clear we can't arrest our way out of this problem. But despite promises by the president to reevaluate US drug policies, more than half of Obama's drug control budget continues to go towards law enforcement. And as the war on drugs rages in America's inner cities, the issue hasn't come up on the campaign trail of either Mr. Obama or his Republican opponent Mitt Romney. Al Jazeera's Fault Lines presenter Sebastian Walker went to Baltimore, one of the country's most dangerous cities. He found that it's African Americans who are paying the biggest price.
This is our war land. We duck, dodge, run, hide behind trees, all this shootouts.
That's what it feels like,
yeah.
that it's just a constant war.
Yeah.
Dante got into dealing drugs after an injury ended his hopes of becoming a basketball player.
You know, so I started dodging the street at 18, you know what I mean, running with the wrong crew. Locked up, shot.
You got shot?
Yeah, I got shot in my back and my leg over this argument about a basketball game. He was on one knee, and he was just pointing, he bow, bow, bow. And the whole time, I didn't know I was hit.
So there's always been a recession in this community?
Right, there's always been a recession in this community. I mean, for any black community, there's always a recession. But we ain't gonna let ourselves go into recession. That's why we're gonna go to the first thing, we're gonna sell drugs. It's the easiest, quicker thing to put $1 in your pocket. What you gonna do? What you gonna run after? The slowest animal or the fastest animal? You're gonna run at the slowest animal, you know you can get them. So you're gonna go feed on that. You lost that bet.
Dante and his friends say the environment they've grown up in makes it difficult to imagine another way of life.
Certain things tear up the neighborhood, so a lot of the fathers is gone now. So there's nobody here to guide the kids. So they turn to all the negative things, because there's nobody here to guide them.
The blame for that, Dante's friends say, shouldn't only be attributed to those sucked into the drug business, one of the few multi-million-dollar industries this city still has left.
Most of the government, they let that in. And that's just plain and simple. They let it in, then once it reaches down to here, all right, we lock the young black youth up. Because that's the only place it's really going.
Baltimore wasn't always a city in decline. It was once a shipping powerhouse, one of the largest seaports of the mid-Atlantic states, and a major center of industrial manufacturing.
In the late 60s, Baltimore had industries like Bethlehem Steel, huge shipbuilding industry, a very active port.
Neil Franklin is a retired police major who spent 34 years in law enforcement. He's seen the decay firsthand.
Late 60s, early 70s mainly, jobs started leaving Baltimore. Industry started leaving, going overseas, wherever it ended up. It just wasn't here in Baltimore anymore. But it was also around that time that Richard Nixon decided that he was going to start a war against public enemy number one, drugs.
But it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one.
You have to show that you have a drug criminal problem. So how do you do that? Through arrest.
At a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise.
We went crazy arresting people for crack cocaine because of this so-called epidemic that we were having.
Incarceration rates began to just soar off the charts.
And we just put tons of black people in prison from our inner cities. Ungodly numbers.
More arrests meant more federal money. It's a system that still exists today in the form of federal job stimulus and other US Department of Justice grants for crime control and community policing.
It's not a war on drugs. Don't ever think it's a war on drugs. it's a war on the blacks. It started as a war on the blacks. It's now spread to Hispanics and poor whites. But initially it was a war on blacks. And it was designed basically to take that energy that was coming out of the civil rights movement and destroy it.
And you can watch the entire Fault Lines report, Baltimore, Anatomy of an American City, on Al Jazeera this Thursday at 03:30 GMT or 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and again on Saturday at 22:30 GMT or 6:30 p.m. Eastern, or online at aljazeera.com. So, is the war on drugs a racist policy or simply a failed one? To discuss this and other issues, we're joined from Syracuse, New York by Deborah Small. She's the executive director of Break the Chains, a drug policy reform advocacy organization. Here in the studio, we have Eric Sterling, president of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. And from Vancouver, we're joined by Kevin Serbet. He's a former senior drug policy advisor for the Obama administration. Deborah Small, then help us first understand this concept, because perhaps it's so alien to many watching, that the drug war is a war on black people and in fact now a war on poor people in general.
So I like the question that you started out with, whether or not the war on drugs was just a racist policy or a failed policy. And I would say that the war on drugs from its inception and through its implementation to today is a racist policy that's been quite successful. And I say that because when you look at the antecedents of our drug policy and look at the history behind what drugs we've chosen to make illegal and who have been the targets of drug law enforcement, you find that each one of those drugs has a racial history attached to it, whether it was opiates and Chinese immigrants, or cocaine and freed African slaves, or marijuana and newly crossed migrants from Mexico who were working at the border states. The reason that we chose to make those drugs illegal and the people who've been targeted for the enforcement of those laws from the beginning have been minorities, and they were designed to be that way. But I would also say, and I agree with those who say that the war on drugs really isn't a war on drugs, it's a war on poor people who happen to use drugs, because we also know that drug use has been as prevalent in middle and upper class communities from the very beginning of the drug war as it is today. And yet drug law enforcement has always been almost exclusively target among the poor and target among minorities, in part because from my perspective, this is about addressing the shift in the civil rights movement that went from demanding equal rights that didn't cost anything to a redistribution of wealth that actually did cost something. And rather than address the problem of continuing poverty, lack of education, poor housing, unemployment, our system has decided that it's much easier to felonize people. And drugs are a very easy thing to felonize people for because they're quite widespread in our society. And once you label someone a drug user or a drug felon, then it no longer matters whether or not they have a decent education, housing, employment, or health care. They're no longer considered deserving of those things. So from my point of view, the drug war has actually been quite successful in serving as a mask for continuing the policy of racial oppression and marginalization that has been in effect in this country for several hundred years.
That is a key point that's quite important to underline, despite the fact that white people are as likely or perhaps more likely to do drugs or deal in drugs. It's black people who are disproportionately being stopped, searched, arrested, and incarcerated. Eric Sterling, arguably you're one of the architects of the current drug policy. I mean, you were a former counsel to the Democrat-controlled U.S. House Judiciary Committee as Reagan and Congress, the Democrat-controlled Congress, were escalating this drug war. Do you recognize these sorts of facets as underpinning the decision to escalate the drug war at the time?
I think that the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which was triggered by the death of two prominent black athletes, reflected racial concerns. I don't think that there was an overt sense that this is an opportunity to screw black people, that this is an opportunity to help maintain white privilege in a conscious way. Not in the same way and not with the same language, I think, that was used in the historical antecedents that Deborah described. What I think operates is an unconscious sort of sense among well-intended people, which is somehow that this is a problem of black people. It is a problem of the ghetto. It is worse there. We need these laws to protect them. There was very much a sense in 1986 that the crack epidemic was an epidemic of black people, and to protect them, we needed to crack down on those who were plaguing them with the traffic. I think what happened then is...
You're just trying to help.
There was ostensibly an attempt to help. What we've seen since then is that the longest sentences have been imposed against the lowest level offenders, neighborhood, street level offenders, who are picked up in part because they are in black neighborhoods. And we've put a black face on the drug problem. So that, in other words, for someone to say, gee, do you think white people have a drug problem too? Of course they do. You know, but our basic, the role of the war on drugs now, because it's really ineffective in keeping drugs out of the hands of kids or preventing crime or the horrific crimes in Mexico and elsewhere, I think is to help maintain white privilege in American society. That's the sociological role that it plays.
But you seem to be suggesting it's a subconscious role in your deliberation.
Exactly. It's subconscious that when if I'm an employer, a black person comes to me for a job interview, gee, do I need to do a criminal background check on that person? Well, I certainly have to do a drug test. Whereas the equivalent qualified white applicant, no, I don't have to worry the same way.
Reflecting the subconscious racism of America.
Yes, yes.
Deborah, what do you make of that? I mean, because you're quite explicit then, as are many others, though, that this is specifically, it wasn't subconscious. But what do you make then of this argument that, no, it was subconscious, perhaps actually on a conscious level, it was just a vote winner? I mean, Tip O'Neill, the House Speaker, just wanted to get some votes, and this was a good issue.
So Eric and I are good friends, and I hate to disagree with him in public, but I actually, while I don't believe that it was overt in the sense that people sat down and developed a plan and said, how can we best address this problem, I do believe that there was a history even before '86 of using race and using crime as a subtext to talk about race, and that was part of the way in which Nixon got elected. It was part of the way in which the Republicans were looking to get back into power, and the issue of crime became synonymous with racial control. And to the degree that the 80s required a new way of being able to translate that language and one that was politically acceptable. The war on drugs provided the way to do that. So you didn't say that you were targeting people because they were black or because they were poor or because they were unemployed or unemployable. You could say that you were targeting them because they were drug users. But the reason that I say that it was not an unconscious racism is because this was happening on the heels of the white counterculture movement, which was driven by drugs. And yet you never saw that kind of drug law enforcement targeting young white kids who were using LSD and marijuana, et cetera, and to have their lives ruined as a result of their drug use the way you saw black people and brown people being targeted.
Kevin Serbett, I mean, we'll get on to Obama's record in a bit, but as you have counseled a few administrations, I think, are they having discussions about this with this context, this racial, social, class context, frankly, about drug policy, or is it simply about law enforcement and indeed perhaps appealing to lowest common denominator voters?
No, it's certainly a consideration, and it should be. I mean, one of the things that President Obama did when he came into office was reduce the crack cocaine disparity, which had previously been 100 to 1. In other words,
yeah, but now it's 1 to 18. I mean, it's still
powder cocaine. And now, and it has been reduced through a bipartisan compromise. It's not equal, but it has been reduced to 1 to 18. What I would say, though, about the broad strokes made about history is to remember that actually our anti-drug laws started over 100 years ago, or actually about 100 years ago, by the great progressive President Woodrow Wilson, who was very concerned about the role cocaine was having in terms of cocaine and also opiates being sold as snake oils, and actually it was white housewives, women, who were consuming many of those those drugs and some of the other pills. Were there racial considerations? I think Deborah's right. There probably were, and we have an unfortunate history in the United States of that. But I think to paint such a broad brush, we have to be very careful, because after all, it was President Richard Nixon who is a little-known fact about him, but I think almost more important than his rhetoric was the fact that he funded and expanded methadone treatment and drug treatment in a way that no president before or since had ever done. So I think it's important to remember that, and also, many of those who marched with Dr. King during the civil rights movement actually were part of the movement to reduce drug abuse in this country when they saw drugs affecting African American and other minority
but through a crackdown.
Disadvantaged communities that could, well, not just through a crackdown, but actually through education. It was community anti-drug coalitions, which there are over 5,000 of them today, and these are simply community action groups who come together to, on a local level, to prevent drug abuse and, for example, stop liquor stores from multiplying in poor neighborhoods or stop tobacco advertising targeting young black kids. These coalitions actually came about from the crack epidemic. At first, the first one was in, one of the first ones was in South Central Los Angeles, led by African Americans. So I think we have to be a little careful when we paint such broad strokes. There's no question that drug policy has disproportionately affected disadvantaged communities, and that needs to be addressed. But the idea that it should be addressed with something like legalization or expanding and spreading drug use, which legalization would do because it would lower the price of drugs.
All right, well, you're moving too fast for us now, Kevin.
I think would be a problem.
Okay, we'll get on to that perhaps a bit later, and I have a feeling we might actually have an extended version of this show for our internet viewers. But let's just run through what the consequences were, whether conscious or unconscious. Let's run through some of the numbers. Clearly, arrests skyrocketed since the 70s. African Americans making up a highly disproportionate percentage of those arrested. African Americans making up about 13% of the US population, and about the same percentage of all US drug users. But according to the American Civil Liberties Union, they account for over 35% of all drug arrests. They represent 55% of all convictions for drug possession, and 74% of all people imprisoned for drug possession. Additionally, sentences imposed on black people in the federal system tend to be about 10% longer than those given for white people. Deborah Small, we got a sense. We got a sense from Sebastian Walker's, from that snippet of Sebastian Walker's documentary there, about the effect this has had on communities. But perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that. Not only that, the effect it has on communities once people are released, and how perhaps the penalty continues.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I think it's really important for us to think about, the fact that not only did we initiate a war on drugs that in fact was a war on drug users that was sold under the guise of going after quote unquote kingpins, but more than 90% of all the people who've ever been prosecuted federally for drug offenses have been, by their definition, low-level drug people. So you have to ask, why do we have that? Why do we give people involved in nonviolent drug crimes longer sentences than we give to rapists, extortioners, and killers? And why is it, that we've passed a whole series of laws that are specifically designed to punish people with drug offenses more seriously than anyone else, so that once you get out of prison for a drug offense, you're now banned from public housing, you're banned from most forms of public employment, you're banned from being able to get money from higher education. In many states, you're banned from voting permanently, and in most states you have to wait a long period of time before you are able to vote again. And these are penalties that attach specifically for drug offenses, not for white-collar crimes, not for many violent crimes. So to me, it all adds up to a scheme that's designed not only to criminalize people and justify locking them up, but to make sure that they are permanently hobbled. Because in the United States, once you have been felonized for drugs, you are felonized for life. And your ability to be able to become economically viable has been permanently hampered. And I think that if you want to draw a line between slavery, Reconstruction, segregation, and incarceration, you see that the common thread through all of them is the belief that punishment is an effective form of both behavior modification and racial control.
Eric Sterling, I'll return to you then as one of those who helped craft some of these laws, specifically actually the mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenders, which has been relaxed since 2010.
Only for crack cocaine,
right,
and only for an insignificant amount.
So it's still pretty important as a factor. do you recognize, again, that description of what these laws meant?
Yeah, I think that Deborah described it well. The point I would sort of add to that is that these laws end up being devastating to the American economy. When you think about millions of people with these felony drug records who are unable then to participate in our economy. They can't buy cars, they can't buy houses, they can't, we're a retail consumer-driven economy, but tens of millions of people are underemployed or unemployed by virtue of these unsuccessful drug laws. If I were an investor, I would be outraged. Excuse me, as an investor, I am outraged at the impact that this has on my portfolio.
Not if you're an investor in prisons there and private security.
But that's a tiny fraction of the economy. Think about, investors in, in any other kind of product, any other corporation, your retirement fund, your union pension fund is all much, 5% a year perhaps less valuable than it would be otherwise, given how the economy is sort of cutting its throat by penalizing so many people who could otherwise be participants in the economy.
But then, so do you judge this drug war, this whole concept of a drug war, Eric Sterling, as a failure?
Certainly. It's a failure in terms of keeping drugs out of the hands of kids. It's a failure in preventing crime. It has minimal effects in sort of deterring people from using drugs.
So what do you make of it then when Jesse Jackson or others say, well, actually, no, it is a success because it has done precisely what it set out to do, which was policing poor people?
If you recognize the crime problems in many urban areas, even that are still much higher than the rest of the country, I don't think you can call that a success.
Kevin Serbet, you have advised President Obama. When President Obama suggests it's time for new approaches, does he mean the sort of issues we've been discussing over the last 20 minutes, or is he talking about something else? What does he mean?
Well, I think a lot of it is some of the issues. I mean, the bottom line is, remember, it's not only drug policies, but it's drug addiction and people's long-standing addiction that causes their unemployability, that causes them not to be members, contributing successful members of society. So let's get down to the core issue here of providing treatment to those, providing, for example, drug courts, as well as testing and sanctions like they do in places like Hawaii or California, with those in the criminal justice system already, because we know that once you're in the criminal justice system, you're more likely to return to it, and you're also more likely to have a drug problem than if you were not in it. So we actually have places that we can work on.
Deborah Small was reacting quite emphatically to that.
Eric was talking about.
Yeah, very quickly. We are running out of time for this initial part.
I know Eric and Deborah are talking.
But what's wrong with that, Deborah Small, this public health approach? What's wrong with the public health approach that we're hearing President Obama wants to pivot to? He might not have done so yet, but that might be the long-term goal for him.
Well, I think the major problem with the approach that Kevin is suggesting is that it doesn't address the problem of racial targeting. It doesn't address the fact that the majority of drug use in America takes place in affluent white communities with people who have jobs and homes and investments. And one thing many of them have addiction problems. Many of them have the social problems that go along with drug abuse. But what they don't have is the police knocking on their door. What they don't have is the justice system watching over them and surveilling them. What they don't have is a bunch of laws and policies punishing them forever for mistakes that they have made. So my bottom line is that I want justice for black people, the same justice that the majority of white people get.
Kevin.
I would like that justice too, Deborah, and I think it can happen within our current policy regime by basically reversing those discriminatory policies, for example, that hamper somebody who's served their time, who's gone through treatment, isn't using anymore, from being able to get a job or being able to get housing.
How about not arresting them in the first place?
We can reverse those, and let's do that. Well, the point is, for a lot of these drug users who are committing crime, an arrest is actually a way for them to get help and get to treatment. Now, I'm not saying it's the default way to do that, but in some circumstances, that's needed. And we've seen the success of drug courts and other mechanisms where that's actually been very helpful to stop this constant selling, using, dealing cycle that we see in places like Baltimore. I mean, they actually need smart policing, not no policing in many of these communities.
I don't think anybody would object to smart policing, but drug courts is not an example of that. The scale of drug courts is infinitesimal. I've gone to the drug court graduation in Montgomery County. 5 people in the graduation. You know, you have 13,000 criminal cases in the county in a year.
Yeah.
These are simply
So
not
Eric,
up to scale.
You're right. We need to bring those up to scale. Well, let's bring them up to scale then. I'd love to work with you
No,
to do that.
not really.
Let's bring
All
these
that does
successful
is
things
widen
up to
the
scale
net for people
versus-
coming into the criminal justice system.
Okay, we're going to leave it there for the moment. We're going to have an extended version now on the internet. For our television viewers, do log in to aljazeera.com to see an extended version of Inside Story Americas. So we're going to continue this discussion on the war on drugs in the US and why it's not an election issue. We still have Deborah Small and Eric Sterling with us. Deborah, you were saying that, I mean, these are the sorts of ideas that we're getting from the Obama administration, even suggestions that this might be a major issue in a second term for President Obama, but this doesn't seem to satisfy you either.
Well, I seriously hope so. One of my biggest disappointments in him is that I know that his experience as a community organizer in Chicago showed him directly the impact of the war on drugs on African American communities. Illinois has the highest rate of disparity in drug arrests and prosecutions in the country. So I have no doubt that Obama understands these issues. The fact that he's chosen not to do anything about them has been a disappointment. And I hate to take away credit on the crack powder issue, but the fact of the matter is that that was a result of 10 years of advocacy by grassroots organizers, and the person in his administration that was most responsible for getting that passed was Vice President Biden. But that being said, I have no expectations that Romney and Ryan would be any better on drug policy than Obama. In fact, I think that they would be much worse. At least this administration understands that we need to put more money into treatment. At least this administration understands that what we're doing now doesn't work. But I will say that the way that they've gone about doubling down on attacking the medical marijuana industry in California has been a huge disappointment to many people who supported Obama and probably won't this time. I will continue to support him. I do continue to support him, and I will vote for him and urge other people to, because I think the stakes are really high. But I also think that the U.S. has to recognize that the winds of change that are blowing up from Latin America and down from Canada on these issues cannot be stopped, and that we are on the wrong side of history and we're on the wrong side of our allies on this issue.
But we've lost.
So if we really want to make real progress, we need to end the war on drugs.
Right, but we've lost Kevin Serbert. But let me suggest to what he might have said to that, which was, the president, his hands are tied, frankly. He has to work with Congress. He did as much as he could and so forth. I mean, what would your response be to that?
He didn't do anything. They didn't put forward any legislation that would address significant sentencing reform, that would get rid of the post-conviction sanctions attached to drug convictions, that would give states more discretion not to reduce barriers imposed on people, or even to put more money in community-based treatment. Because this idea that you should have to get arrested before you can get treatment is preposterous to me. And so from my point of view, if anything, the lesson of alcohol prohibition told us that what it gave us was a greater level of criminality and a much greater level of crime and violence. When we got rid of alcohol prohibition, we did not get rid of alcoholism, nor did we get rid of all alcohol-related violence, but we did get rid of the criminal organizations that were killing each other and shooting up our streets over the profits for alcohol. Why we can't see the same lesson as it relates to drug prohibition, I do not understand.
Eric Sterling, do you get the sense that when you look at both President Obama and Romney's platforms, to an extent, they're still looking at drug abuse as a personal failing, perhaps? Or, I mean, are they really taking into account all the sort of social issues that we've been talking about over the last half an hour?
My sense is that there's been almost nothing on Romney's campaign website about this issue. I was involved in trying to confront Romney in New Hampshire during the primary, and he is adamant, in rejecting any idea that anything other than sort of an incarceration approach makes any sort of sense. He would do nothing, I think, that would be considered an improvement that would result in an improvement in the lives of drug users, which I think, when you think about what the goal of a drug law is, you want to save lives of drug users, you want to reduce the harm to the community. and there's nothing in Mr. Ryan's record either to suggest, any interest in this.
But do you think they're using this as a social control mechanism, though, as has been alleged?
I think it's it's about politics, and they're not. From their perspective, I don't think they feel any need to raise it. They've outlined what their portfolio of issues are. It's the economy is what the issue's about, and this becomes, this raises risks for them the way raising women's issues can become. It could blow up in their face. President Obama, aside from your comment about sort of the limitations of Congress, he has the power to commute the sentences of people who've been unjustly imprisoned. This is a Article 2 power. It's in the same sentence of the Constitution that says he's the commander-in-chief. He has used this power more stingily than any other president. He was advised on the way to the inauguration by President Bush, set up a policy to use this pardon power. Nancy Pelosi was present when he did this, and he failed to use that power, and I'm very disturbed by that. Because this is completely within his discretion.
Deborah Small, though, given
Yes.
that this issue is so bound up in race, though, perhaps intentionally, as you've suggested, do you feel it's more likely or less likely that an African-American president will want to deal with this?
Well, I would hope that Obama would not want to be the African-American president who was part of continuing the process of mass incarceration of African people that he was the president of. I would hope that he would not want to be the African-American president that presided over the continued decline of the economy in Honduras, throughout the Caribbean, Guatemala, and lots of Latin America, because they're prosecuting the drug war that we've insisted that they participate in. So I'd like to believe that President Obama will show more leadership on this issue. But I also believe that good presidents and real leaders have to be made by the people. And in the same way that the LGBT community pushed Obama to actually move further on same-sex marriage than he was willing to, and to actually endorse the idea of marriage equality, I believe that we have to push Obama to take a stand on prohibition, to acknowledge what we all know, that it doesn't work, and that we have to begin to explore alternatives. I don't expect him to embrace the position of full regulation and control that I believe in for currently illicit substances, but I do believe that he should be willing to sit down and talk with the presidents of Mexico, Bolivia, Uruguay, Guatemala, Bolivia, and others who have urged him to begin to seek alternatives to a failed policy that is causing more harm than good.
Deborah Small, thank you very much. Eric Sterling, thank you.
Shihab, could I just note that Governor Gary Johnson and Judge Jim Gray, the candidates from the Libertarian Party, take a very strong position in favor of a much more progressive approach. And Deborah is going to vote for Barack Obama for re-election. I'm going to vote for Johnson and Gray. I was an Obama supporter, but I don't feel he's earned my vote. And I think that we do a disservice to our viewers if we don't mention that there is a third party and a candidate who's very forthrightly suggesting that we do away with the current approach.
But also various other very complicated platform, which we will explore and have explored a number of times on Inside Story US 2012. But thank you so much for that. Eric Sterling, thank you. Deborah Small, thanks again. Kevin Serbett, our thanks to him, even though he's gone. That's all for the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program.